Aloha friends, it's Robert Stehlik with Blue Planet Surf. I'm here at the Blue Planet Adventure Company deck in Haleiwa next to the Rainbow Bridge on the Anahulu River. Beautiful place to paddle. And today's video is all about board volume. What does it mean? What's the best volume for you? And how to choose the right board for what you need. So let's start with what is board volume. So basically the volume is the amount of flotation a board has. And the way it's measured usually is in liters. And the metric system kind of makes a lot of sense because 1 liter of water is defined as 1 kilogram of weight. 1 liter displacement, like basically pushing 1 liter of water out of the way, will create lift of 1 kilogram, flotation of 1 kilogram. So for example, these boards right here are 11 foot by 35 Tough Tech model has 250 liters of volume, okay? So that means if you pushed that board all the way underwater, it would displace or push aside 250 liters of water, and that basically creates a lift of 250 kilograms. So to sink this board, you would have to place 250 kilograms of weight on top of it, and that would push it all the way underwater. So that's basically it. And if you imagine like a bathtub full of water or a swimming pool full of water filled to the brim, if you push that board underwater, it would push out of the pool 250 liters of water. Basically, that's the volume of the board, okay? So now you're thinking 250 liters to convert kilograms, 250 kilograms into pounds. It's about 2.2 pounds per liter. So 100 liters floats 220 pounds, 250 liters, let's do the calculation real quick. So if I have 250 liters of volume, that creates 250 kilograms of lift. To convert that into pounds, I go times 2.2. So this board can actually float up to 550 pounds of weight. But that doesn't mean a paddler that's 550 pounds can paddle on it, because it's very hard to paddle a board that's underwater, right? So ideally for a beginner, you want the volume to be at least twice the volume that you need to float you. I would say roughly 1 pound per liter of volume. So that's a really simple rule. So 250 liter board is good for people up to 250 pounds roughly. And of course, if you're lighter than that, it's fine. It'll be more stable. But to a certain degree, if the board has too much volume, it's actually kind of corky and floats high in the water. And the higher you are off the water surface, the less stable you're going to be. So as the lower you are to the water surface, the more stability you have, just because you have a lower center of gravity, basically. So that's the rule for beginners. So now if you're a more advanced stand-up paddle surfer and you want to ride waves, you want to basically use a board with the minimum amount of volume possible, because a smaller board will just handle better in the waves. It'll grab better in the turns. It'll allow you to do tighter maneuvers. A shorter, narrower, thinner board will just be a more high-performance board, more like a surfboard shortboard, and then a thick, fat, high-volume board that's wide. The really top pro guys on stand-up paddle surfboards will often use boards that don't even float them. The volume is less than they need to float them, so when they're just standing on the board, it'll sink underwater. So they need to actually paddle and create dynamic lift to get above to the water surface, and then once you're on a wave, the speed you're riding creates lift, dynamic lift from the water pushing from underneath the board, creates lift to lift it up on the surface. And then you can use a much lower volume board. Obviously, the volume doesn't matter as much when you're moving fast. Now, dynamic lift is basically when the water pushes against the bottom of the flat board on the bottom, it'll lift up, create lift against the board. So that's also why once you start moving and paddling, the board's going to feel more stable. That's because of the dynamic lift created from moving across the water surface. There's some other exceptions to the rule of about 1 pound per liter of volume. For example, if you're racing and you have like a really big 14-foot race board or unlimited race board, usually those have much higher volumes. Like, for example, we got that orange unlimited board behind me. that's going to have much higher volume. Let's see how much volume this one has. This is a 17.6 board, and this one has 368 liters of volume. So it has lots of flotation, and that helps make it stable and easier to paddle. Okay, but then on a race board, basically the goal is to go more narrow so you have less drag from the width of the board. Yeah, let's go inside the shop and we'll talk a little bit more about volume, okay? So you'll see on most boards the volume's printed right on the side of the board. Some boards have it on the bottom, but this is the last figure here, 160 liters, 199 liters. So the volume of the board is really important to know. I feel like it's almost more important than the length and the width of the board, but probably I would say the volume and the width are the most important for knowing if it's going to be stable and have enough volume for you, basically. So let's look at two different boards just to see how the same length can have a totally different volume and different characteristics. So these two boards here are the Leahy and the Little Fishbone model. They're both Blue Planet Smart epoxy construction, and they're both 9'1" in length. So, but they are actually quite different in the way they act on the water, and the volume, as you can see, the 9'1" by 30 Leahy is 133 liters, and the Little Fishbone is 9'1" by 32, so 2 inches wider, and has 162 liters of volume. So, and a lot of that comes from having a little wider nose and tail, and then also the Leahy is a little bit fuller in the rails. So it has thicker rails, while the Leahy model has thinner rails. So the rails carry a lot of the volume, and then the 2 inches wider obviously also adds a little bit of volume. The thickness on both boards is exactly the same, you know. So just from knowing the thickness and the length and the width, it's hard to calculate the volume because it's also, every board has a taper. So the center of the board, this is where you would measure the thickness, is the widest point of the thickness. But like this board, you can see has a little bit less volume in the nose. It's real thin in the nose and tail, versus the Little Fishbone has a little bit more meat, both in the nose and also in the tail. You can see that this tail on the Leahy gets really thin in the back, and the Little Fishbone has a little bit more thickness. So the thinner tail with the thin rails really helps when you carving turns. It'll hold better in a fast turn, versus the wider board with the thicker, more volume rails makes it a little bit easier to catch the waves. If there's smaller surf or has less energy, having a wider, thicker tail just makes it easier to catch a wave. You know, so just knowing the length and the thickness doesn't really tell you much. You have to know the shape of the rails, how the volume tapers from nose to tail, how the outline of the board is, and so on. And then, for example, on inflatable boards, one of the issues is that they're the same thickness all the way through. So they don't have that taper where they get thinner on the nose and tail. They're the same thickness all the way through, so they're quite thick on the nose and tail. What is the downside of having too much volume? As I mentioned earlier, having a lot of volume can make the board corky because you have a higher center of gravity, you're higher off the water. Another thing with boards that have too much volume is that they catch more side wind. So on a windy day, a board with a thick nose and tail that sticks out of the water will catch more of the side wind, and it'll make it harder to paddle into the wind and also paddle sideways to the wind, because they'll tend to want to push you downwind. And one of the things about inflatables is that they're usually the same thickness all the way through, from the center all the way to the nose and tail of the board. And so you have much more volume in the nose and the tail of the board than one of these boards, for example. So in hard boards, you're able to taper the volume, have most of the volume in the middle where you stand, and less volume in the nose and tail where you don't need it as much. So if you have a thick nose and tail that sticks out of the water, it just makes the board less aerodynamic, basically, and catches more of that wind that'll push you sideways. Okay, so to summarize, just make sure you have enough volume in your board that you can comfortably stand on it without it sinking. It'll make your life a lot easier as a beginner. And then as you get more advanced, you can use a lower volume board. And for surfing, having a lower volume board is ideal. Don't get a board that has too much volume, because then that can feel quirky and less stable. Hope this helps you out with your board choices. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the water. Aloha.